Hi, it's John Florez again, and I just had a major epiphany I want to share with you. Probably comes with getting older. I just turned 72 last month, and I started reflecting on my life, and in particular, my career as a record producer. What's interesting, and is the epiphany, is that when I was hired at RCA at age 22 back in 1968 to become a record producer, a staff producer for a major label, I was entering the music industry at a, the end of an era. And the era was staff producers. This was the norm when I entered and was soon not to be. So what was further interesting at the time was that staff producers like me produced, for the most part, single-oriented, catchy tune, top 40, 45 RPM records that went on albums. Album sales for many of us were not as huge as our singles were. Why? Well, first, the style of music. If you look back through the 60s, there were a lot of catchy little things, for instance, Neil Diamond, Neil Sedaka, even the Mamas and Papas, The Fifth Dimension, Up, Up and Away in My Beautiful Balloon. You had Steve Barry with the Grassroots and Tommy Rowe. So you had Sooner or Later and I Feel Dizzy. It's kind of, if you trace it all the way back to 50s with Elvis and the Platters and acts like that, you can see that everything was single-oriented. AM radio was dominant, and they wanted under 3-minute cuts produced because that's all they would play. FM virtually didn't exist. It was just beginning. All of us had to produce our records in monophonic, not stereo, and sometimes put a stereo version on the B side so that the fledgling FM stations could play it. For the most part, though, we were pop single producers. And I'll give you an example. This was the end of that era, and I was just entering it then and thought it was the norm. At RCA, we had my boss, Joe Reisman, who produced Henry Mancini and Hugo Montenegro's orchestra. He also did the Joe Reisman Orchestra and Chorus. We had Jack Please, who was doing Jack Jones, Ed Ames, Harry Belafonte. We had Rick Girard, who was doing Feliciano and John Hartford. And we had me with the Friends of Distinction, and then Willie Hutch. At Columbia, you had Jack Gold, who, like Joe Reisman and our label, was head of A&R, but he produced Johnny Mathis and a couple of other artists, I believe Percy Faith, Vicky Carr. And then you had Jerry Fuller, who was the star over there doing Gary Puckett and the Union Gap, and another fellow who was producing The Spiral Staircase. At Capitol Records, you had Al DeLore producing Glenn Campbell. At A&M, you had Jack Doherty producing The Carpenters. At Warner Brothers, before they made the shift to album-oriented artists, you had Lenny Waronker, now a legend, producing Harper's Bazaar, which was the 59th Street Bridge song, Feeling Groovy. We were all making cute, catchy pop records. Now a new trend was beginning to develop, and that was album-oriented artists. So you did have Jim Hilton at Warner Brothers producing, say, The Iron Butterfly. Their hit single was In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. And I remember thinking, what kind of music is that? That didn't relate to I Love My Calendar Girl by Neil Sedaka. It was just too hard, grating for me. I didn't understand it, and I thought it wouldn't last. Ha! Boy, was I wrong. And you had Clive Davis over at Columbia beginning to make the shift away from Jack Gold, Jerry Fuller, and he was signing Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the Holding Company and other artists and beginning the trend. Once he began the trend, Warner Brothers followed. But in the meantime, if you were shopping an act in Los Angeles, you would see the group of us that I just described, who are all top 40, 3-minute, singles-oriented producers. And I remember one guy walking into RCA to see me saying, "Hey, I'm a good artist. Why don't you like my rock stuff? Is there anybody here at your label that really appreciates this stuff?" Well, no, there wasn't. In addition, at the time, RCA had the lowest paying royalty rate for its staff producers of any label in the nation. It was 0.008%. So for instance, I had 2 gold records in a row when I was age 23 while I was staff producer at RCA. It was on the Friends of Distinction, and my total royalties were in the neighborhood of $20,000 for 2 gold records. That, with my salary of $16,900, was not very good, but that's what they paid. Columbia was paying 2% to their staff producers, Capitol was paying 2%, I believe, to their producers, and Warner Brothers was paying 3%, I believe. So, in other words, Warner Brothers was paying their staff producers almost 4 times what I was getting in royalties at RCA. Moreover, for getting money, there was a mentality. Staff producers' mentality was, take the act that the label assigns you, or if there's a slot, find an artist and sign them, and go in to either your assigned act or the one you found, produce them quickly, cheaply, and AM radio oriented with 3-minute productions. Okay, so we were like a factory. All of us were doing factory work at the time. That was very soon to shift, and all of a sudden, we were dinosaurs. But I didn't know it at the time because it hadn't quite happened yet. The tell, so to speak, was when we had a meeting at RCA New York, at headquarters, with everyone from all locations that were in the creative divisions. So we even had Chet Atkins there from Nashville. What happened at the meeting is that the decision was made to begin dropping the middle-of-the-road artists like Jack Jones, Ed Ames, Harry Belafonte, all of those folks. And I was just appalled because I was still back in the previous mindset of the great stand-up singers and then the catchy 3-minute oriented acts. So I didn't know what in the world they were doing, keeping classical music, but getting rid of their middle-of-the-road singers. I was appalled and I lost. I was not in the majority, so those guys were on their way out. So it appears that even RCA was getting the drift that music was shifting, and music was going to shift toward albums. Music was also going to shift to independent producers who did not work for the label, but who were commissioned by the label to produce acts, and hopefully album-oriented acts. But I didn't get the memo on that, so I was still cranking away factory-like stuff. Okay, let's segue to when I left RCA and became an independent producer. Since I was still in the same mindset I was as a staff producer, I figured that what I would be as an independent producer was basically I would be perceived by the industry as a staff producer who now worked for himself and was able to work for others. So just assign me something and I'll do it. Wrong. The industry looked for, quote, hot producers, those people who were on a roll and making big hit records. My specialty was vocalists, not artists, not singers, not singer-songwriters, but vocalists. Those were people where the tunes were selected, they came in and sang it, and they left. So I figured out on the open market I would get calls for that, because people knew that I could bring it in under budget very quickly and that there could be a hit record in there. If not, it still was cute, catchy, and 3-minute oriented. Well, wrong. My phone rang off the hook when I had rocked the boat because I was perceived as hot. It was never in my mindset to be a hot record producer. I was a factory mechanic, so to speak. I was just available to do a job for folks on vocalists. To make matters even worse, I had become a niche producer. I wasn't myself a niche producer, but the perception of the industry was that I was, and my niche was pop R&B groups, or mocha mix music. They used to call me the guy who makes mocha mix music. That is watered down black music so that it will go pop. Well, newsflash, if I'm out as an independent producer, no black executive until the very last year that I was in the business ever offered me a project in all the years I worked in Hollywood. Why? There was tremendous pressure to hire blacks to produce black artists. I was caught in kind of a social conundrum, and I didn't know it. So I just went ahead on, and oh my goodness, Don Berkheimer offered me the Hughes Corporation. That was a 3-person black act that ended up with, we had a #1 record with Rock the Boat, and my favorite record for them, Freedom for the Stallion. But that wasn't offered by any of the black division heads. That was offered by Don Berkheimer, the white head of A&R for RCA Records. When I got Frida Payne for Capitol Records, I was offered that through Stan Hanman, her manager, who was another white guy that offered me an act. When I got offered Johnny Mathis, it was from Mickey Eichner at Columbia Records, another white guy. This goes on and on. When I did Carl Graves for A&M, Kip Cohen, another white guy, offered me Carl Graves and then signed my group LAX. Mickey Eichner at Columbia also offered me, and I accepted the assignment to do Ronnie Dyson. LAX was signed by Joe Smith, the president of Warner Brothers, another white executive. And my favorite act since leaving RCA, that was Five Flights Up. And Five Flights Up was a pop black act like the Friends of Distinction and the Fifth Dimension. And that was given to me by Eddie Rosenblatt at Talent Associates, another white guy. And who offered me the Fifth Dimension when Rock the Boat was hot? Clive Davis, another white guy. I never got the vast majority of work that was out there for pop R&B because I was white. I didn't play the game. I had no idea there was even a game going on. I was just available to crank work cheaply and efficiently. So, as the label switched to album-oriented acts, Lenny Waronker switched to singer-songwriters, other people shifted to their genres, and all of a sudden there was a whole slew of music from the Eagles to Joni Mitchell, all the Electra artists that were doing their thing. Warner Brothers was the country club of all production houses because their staff producers produced great albums. I'll tell you, the clue should have been to me, and wasn't because I was so dumb, is that my Johnny Mathis album for Columbia made me more money with no hits on it. It was just a Johnny Mathis album that sold worldwide, and I made from that first royalty check what I made from my first royalty check on Rock the Boat, a #1 single. And on a no-hit Johnny Mathis album, I equaled it on my first royalty check on an album. Oops. Didn't even occur to me. I just said, thank you, that's a very nice paycheck, and we'll move on, and what do you got for me next? Oh my, I just didn't get it. I'll tell you what I miss the most about the music business, and it certainly isn't the business of music, because that's a nasty little business. When I was there, and I don't know what it's like nowadays, but I lost work because I wasn't bisexual. I lost work because I didn't do drugs. I wouldn't even allow drugs on my sessions or alcohol on my sessions, with the exception of John Mathis, who could have a couple of glasses of wine. Now, most artists at the time, I would say a huge percentage of artists at the time, were partaking in drugs. So I was the outsider, not them. I didn't take bribes, I didn't offer bribes, I didn't do any of the things that were necessary to be a successful, quote, hot, unquote, producer, because I was just a guy available to crank some music if you needed it done quickly and under budget. That's also, by the way, why I turned down Melissa Manchester. She and I met and discussed what she wanted to do, and she wanted to spend a few months in the studio and experiment and see what she came up with, and maybe smoke a little weed and whatever, and I didn't want to do it. I mean, it's never taken me that long to make an album. I certainly don't want to experiment on record label time. I just want to cut the record and get out of there. Clive Davis, by the way, told me that he offered Richard Perry, the fabulous producer, 3 middle-of-the-road artists while he was at Columbia. Well, Clive was at Columbia. And I may get them wrong, but I think it was Vicky Carr, Percy Faith, and Johnny Mathis. Could have been Andy Williams. I don't know. And Richard turned it down, and Clive said that's the smartest thing Richard's ever done because there's no money in it. I mean, you got to have a hit, album-oriented rock act to make some money. Well, I said, Clive, I would have taken those in a heartbeat. Gosh, offer me that deal, I'll take it right now. Because I work with vocalists, not artists, and these guys are pros. They will come into the studio prepared, they will do their thing, we'll cut most of them full orchestra and they'll just come back for vocals. We'll be in and out quickly, it'll be great sounding stuff. We don't need any hit records because they sell a handful of albums, and I will get my advance check and possibly a nice royalty check like I did with Johnny Mathis. No fuss, no worry, you're dealing with pros, in and out, done. And Clive looked at me and said, you want to work with over-the-hill artists? And I said, I'll work with real professionals any day. Drug-free, quick and easy, make the records, have some fun, mix it, and be done with it. So I guess what I'm telling you is that the epiphany is that what I was trained to be at RCA was totally contingent on being a singles-oriented hit record producer. I'm sorry, hit single producer, and that did not equate to going independent, because on the independent market, labels were looking for hot producers. I remember getting the call from Clive Davis on The Fifth Dimension and his saying, you're a hot producer with the #1 record in the country. And I thought, well, okay, I've had a #3 record in the country before with Grazing in the Grass by the Friends of Distinction. I don't get this hot part of the equation. I'm what would you call it in baseball terms? A utility infielder. As long as you put me in there to deal with vocalists, I'm in hog heaven and you'll get a good record. But don't send me artists, for God's sakes. So I'll wrap this up by saying this whole epiphany was started by seeing the documentary on the group Chicago and then reading a couple of books by their members and saying, oh my God, I mean, I couldn't do it. I couldn't work with them. I don't care how good they are. I don't care how much money everybody made. I certainly couldn't have done what David Foster did and just take them and remake their sound for a period of time. I could, that didn't have integrity to me, even though it was very, very, very successful. Great. Couldn't have done it. But artists, no. Drugs, months in the studio, all kinds of ego conflicts, everything like that. I remember telling Lenny Waronker, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do Maria Muldaur and James Taylor and Gordon Lightfoot and all the people that he did. I don't know how you do it. So I highly recommend you check out the Chicago documentary or books by their members. It's really an insight into what it was like to be in the mainstream of music at a point where I was really on my way out, because I belonged as a producer really late 50s, through the 60s, and then maybe early to mid-70s, and that's it. I should have been long gone by then. But I think in retrospect, had you given me another, I don't know, 5 to 10 years before my career started, I could have made those records great, could have made the records that I ended up making great, and then bye-bye. My father said at the time, was the worst decision you ever made leaving RCA as a staff producer. And I got to tell you, as I told him, I made a lot more money being what I would call an unsuccessful independent producer for several years. But my heart was with my staff members, my buddies, my family at RCA. And I'll miss that forever. So in my heart, yeah, leaving RCA was really difficult. Let me also put on a postscript. The thing that I loved the most, other than working with singers, is that as a staff producer at RCA, you had 3 studios on the bottom floor. And forget the fact that the other artists like Elvis and the Jefferson Starship and Feliciano and Mancini and all of those people were recording there. It was a fraternity atmosphere in the lobby of the RCA bottom floor studio center. It was called the Music Center of the World, and by God it was, because it's the camaraderie with the studio musicians and the, I would say, the middle of the road artists that I love the most, because you could be in a washroom next to Ray Brown, the legendary bass player, or Henry Mancini. You could say hi to Hal Blaine, Jim Gordon, Paul Humphreys, Larry Carlton, on and on. I won't do anybody justice. I mean, there are probably 30, 40 guys and women, a couple of harpists and violinists and cellists. But it's that camaraderie with the studio musicians, studio singers, and artists that I miss incredibly. It was just a treat to be amongst them every day of my life. So I was an old-time, old mentality, on my way out as a staff producer of music that would no longer be as popular as it once was. But that camaraderie with my fellow professionals is something I will miss for the rest of my life as well. And frankly, if I had to do another overdub session of anything, hand claps, congas, cowbells, cymbal crashes, anything you could imagine, if I had to do one more overdub session, I probably couldn't have stood it. That's it. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.